Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT, and it's my pleasure to welcome you with us today. Today is Tuesday, November 21st. We are following several interesting stories over the past few weeks, and we have a great panel of journalists here to help us decipher them. We want to welcome back today Derek Carson, who is a reporter for the Bennington Banner, who also writes for the Manchester Journal. And it's a great pleasure to welcome for the first time Howard Weiss-Tisman, who covers Southern Vermont for Vermont Public Radio. Before that, he worked at the Brattleboro Reformer for 11 years, I believe, and knows Windham County well. Anyway, once again, it seems like the timing of our show coincides with some interesting developments on the Act 46 front, the education consolidation law that passed a couple of years ago and sort of is encouraging, I guess that's one way to put it, school districts to consider merging with comparable districts to form smaller numbers of school entities. So we're coming up on some major deadlines. At last, sort of things are finally beginning to kind of get to the point where decisions need to be made. At the end of this month, school districts have to have approved plans in place if they want to qualify for the famous tax incentives, the reductions in the property tax that would scale down over a period of 4 or 5 years. And then on December 26th, plans have to be in place. Otherwise, the big bad hammer of the state, I guess, gets poised for falling. But Derek, let's start with you. In the past week or so, we had a really big vote in Bennington down your way, involving Bennington, Shasbury, Pownell, and Woodford. And I guess for the lack of 6 votes across 2 towns, nada.
And it's really interesting. This was a merger proposal that had been crafted over the last year that would have seen those 4 towns and the Mount Anthony Union School District, which does middle and high school for those towns, as well as the village of North Bennington, merged into a single pre-K through 12 district. In total, between the 4 communities that voted, it passed overwhelmingly. However, you needed 3 out of those 4 communities to see it come to fruition. In Woodford, there were about 60 to 70 votes total. It missed it by 2 votes there. In Pownell, there were about 400 votes. It missed it by about 4. Exactly 4, I should say. So really disheartening for the people that had been going community to community, holding public forums, trying to get support for what they felt was a good compromise between the demands the state is placing on these towns through Act 46 and keeping an amount of the culture and the desires of the local communities. One of the big things was the structure of the board. It would have been structured exactly the same way the Mount Anthony Union Board has been structured for over 50 years now. And it's been working well for the communities. They liked having what's called a hybrid at-large representation. Essentially, people run as being from their various towns. It's not a completely at-large system, but everyone from all the communities votes on everyone. That was back in the early 70s. It went up to the Supreme Court. I don't remember the name of the case, Mount Anthony versus someone or another. And otherwise, had that not been put into place, they would have been required to go to proportional representation. Bennington would have 70% of the seats on the board. That really was a non-starter for the smaller towns. This would have been a way to sort of get around that. Bennington would have had still the plurality of votes on the board, but not a majority, so they couldn't approve anything themselves. They really felt that this was a strong, locally created merger plan. So to see it go down by that few votes, it was definitely disheartening for them.
And the recounts, I guess, have validated the initial results.
Yep, Woodford recounted their votes last week. Of course, with how close it was, citizens immediately submitted petitions for recounts. Pownell just recounted theirs last night. Both withheld the initial results. So at this point, you're going to see them submit each district's board submit those reports to the state, but by the end of December, like we said. The only other option in speaking with folks at the Agency of Education, if 5% of the voters petition the school board, or if the school board decides to warn a revote, they can do that. However, it has to be warned 30 days in advance of the vote. There's no way at this point that they can make that November 30 deadline for those tax incentives. When you talked about encouragement earlier, the state sort of took a carrot and stick approach. The carrot is now off the table, essentially, for the SVSU. So all that's really left is the stick. We'll see the agency or the Secretary of Education submit her plan next June, and then the State Board of Education will approve it, and we could see Bennington and the other towns merged in a way similar to this, but without some of those protections that were built into this proposal. So again, really, for the people who had been studying this, a very disappointing result.
Meanwhile, over on the other side of the mountain, Howard, in your neck of the woods there in Windham County, there was another vote in Windham Southeast that seemed to fail spectacularly. All 4 towns involved voted it down.
That's right, and Windham Southeast was very different than what happened over here. There were 4 towns, Brattleboro, Dummerston, Guilford, and Putney. All 4 of them overwhelmingly rejected it. It was 2-1 in most of the towns. And so that merger proposal went down, and what's happening now in Act 46 is we're really in the home stretch of this law that's been going on for 2 years now. And there were kind of different deadlines as the law progressed. And there was this first tier, we got the most tax incentives, and then we were at the second tier that you were talking about, ends November 30th. And so right now, the towns that don't have merger plans have until December 26th to put together what the state calls alternative governance structures, which basically means that school districts get to keep their own school board, which is what a lot of these school districts that were post-Act 46 wanted to do. But they have to convince the Secretary of Education and the State Board of Education that in doing that, they can meet the goals of Act 46. And a lot of that has to do with equity and saving some money and transparency. And this alternative governance structure model, it's kind of interesting. What I've been learning about is that your plan is not approved by the state board. So what you do is like you put together this alternative governance structure and you submit it to the Secretary of Education, basically saying, this is what we're going to do. We're going to keep our board. We're going to work with our neighbors. We're going to be able to offer Spanish and phys ed and everything else. And that's pretty much it from there. The State Board of Education and the Secretary can work with the boards and can ask you questions and can have you alter the plans if possible, but it's not an approval process from here. Basically, the boards around the state are going to be suggesting this new structure, and then the Secretary will take that information and write this state plan. And this is where the stick, like Derek was mentioning, comes in, is like, how much power will the state have then to force a merger? So if the Secretary of Education doesn't like an alternative governance structure, which might come out of Windham Southeast or anywhere else, in the reporting I did for my last story, about a quarter of the districts in the state, somewhere between 70 or 80 districts, don't have merger plans in place. So it's a lot of districts. When Act 46 was going through its first year or so, the Agency of Education was very quick to point out, half the districts have already got their plans in place. And I think there was a lot of movement at first. There were a lot of districts who had been thinking about this, who had maybe even thought about this before Act 46, but there were a lot of outliers, and as I said, there's about a quarter of the districts in the state are going to be putting these alternative governance structures together. And what the Secretary does from there, we'll be writing more stories about that. We'll have to see. If she doesn't like these plans, supposedly she can make a recommendation that, District A, you gave your alternative governance structure, but we don't like it, and we want you to merge with nearby, and we'll have to see what happens.
Right, and it's really difficult to predict. We know what the communities will want. They're going to submit these reports saying that they should keep their school boards. But especially in the SVSU, we've heard many times from many different people who have come down from Montpelier who have said, you already have the Mount Anthony Union District. You've shown you've been able to have a consolidated middle and high school district for 50 years now. So to make the argument that it would be impossible to merge the elementary school districts, we've been told that's going to be a tough sell to the Agency of Education. On your side of the mountain, it seems that the communities have a little more confidence in perhaps being able to keep their school boards with how strongly the voting results went?
Well, yes and no, because I don't know if the debate amongst the schools are so much educational in the fact that it seemed like a lot of people didn't want to do it because they didn't want to do it, because they wanted to keep their local boards. There was a lot of arguments that people like going to town meeting and people like talking about their school budgets at town meeting. And you kind of lose that when there's one big district and one budget. So there were not a lot of arguments educationally that we can't do this because it's a mountain. I mean, there's a lot of schools, Dummerston and Putney are very close together. It would be very easy to see one board overseeing all of that. But we're going to have to see what they come up with. Yeah, it's hard to say.
It's interesting to hear how the conversation was framed in Windham County, because here the study committee very much tried to give off the message that voting no on this vote is not a vote against Act 46. Act 46 is the law of the land. This is just whether we're trying to make the best of a bad situation, was how they framed it. So it's interesting to see how the different communities had that discussion.
Right, and what they were really talking about in Windham County, and in a lot of I went to Act 46 meetings all around the state, is that we have to do this anyway. And if we don't do this now, the state board is going to force it. And at least if we write our own plan, you know, we can make decisions. We could decide on the size of the board. We could decide on how we're going to share Spanish and music, et cetera. And once the state tells us what they want, that's kind of taken out of our hands.
It's going to be interesting to see exactly how forcefully the state does attempt to implement some of that, because I'm sure they're going to run into a lot of resistance locally when push really does come to shove. You know, well, how rigorous are we going to? Is it just going to be like sort of this diktat coming down from Montpelier saying, well, we've looked at your situation, this is what we think is the way to go to meet the requirements of the law, and you guys had your chance to come up with something that was more tailored to your local conditions, but
yeah, and this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but there's also this really interesting aspect that the state has said. So if a town has school choice, the state cannot force them to give up school choice. Mm-hmm. That if there's school choice in a town and that's what the people want, the state can't force that. So the state is not going to be able to take, if there's one district surrounded by merged districts and only that one district has school choice, the state can't put that in a district because we know that's unconstitutional.
Right, and we have that situation down in southern Bennington County with North Bennington. They are part of the SVSU, which is all operating districts except for them, who they have choice pre-K through 6. Regardless of what happens, there's no way that the state could merge North Bennington with, say, Shaftesbury-Bennington without a vote from the townspeople to essentially give up school choice, which they had 2 positive votes a year apart not that long ago. So I'd be very surprised if they went in that direction.
And what might happen? North Bennington?
We've discussed that a little bit. What would most likely happen is that North Bennington would remain in the SVSU with whatever the configuration the other districts ended up in, because they need an SU to provide certain services, special education, technology, things like that. So they would remain a part of that, because the issue is they can't find another partner, because in order to get out of the Mount Anthony Union, and Act 46 did not change this, there was hope that that might provide sort of an escape hatch for them. The state has said no. In order to leave Mount Anthony Union, you would have to have a positive vote in each of the other communities that's a part of that. The North Bennington board has considered it, but at this point they see that as being very unlikely to pass.
So they're going to let North Bennington keep choice and become
right.
part?
It's sort of between a rock and a hard place. There's no way they can take away their choice, and there's no way they can force them out of MAU. Both of those have to be community votes, so they essentially would remain as they are.
Interesting. Well, just to conclude this part of it on the education side of things, we also have a principal search underway at Mount Anthony. Great timing, I would imagine, that some of those guys are thinking to be doing that.
Right. Well, it's better than Arlington, which went under a superintendent search in the midst of all this Act 46 discussion. Right. But for Mount Anthony Union, their principal resigned in August. She had already said she would be resigning in June. As it was As it was said, the principal and the school came to a mutual understanding where she would submit her resignation. We don't know the exact details of what went on behind closed doors there, but it's no secret that from the moment she was hired, she was not a popular candidate among the teachers and among parents. There was an internal candidate who was preferred. Those politics kind of spilled over. You had teachers signing petitions demanding her removal before she'd even started the job.
And that was only about 2 years ago.
That was exactly 2 years ago. So there was a tumultuous relationship there. To its credit, though, the SVSU has really stepped up, and they've already hosted last week one public forum about the principal search. It's barely gotten underway at this point. They've just announced who's going to be on the committee. It's going to be 4 parents, members of the SU staff, teachers, but board members. But already they're holding public forums to discuss with the community what they want to see in a principal. Teachers are talking about what they want to see in a principal. So it feels a lot more like a community effort. Obviously, the superintendent will have the final say on which candidate is hired, just like last time. But it seems that they're trying to learn from the mistakes that they made, that maybe this tumultuous relationship could have been avoided if the process had been a little more open, and maybe people had had an opportunity to meet the candidate before the announcement was made and before there was that disappointment about losing your preferred candidate. So we're certainly well before any lists of candidates being released or anything like that. The curriculum director of the SVSU has graciously, I think, offered to, while continuing to do her duties, step in as principal of the high school through at least the end of December, so they can get this search started. And she might continue through the end of the year. That's been discussed. I couldn't imagine doing 2 very, very intense jobs like that at once, but she's done a good job so far from all the teachers I've talked to. So that's the situation now. They're really trying to have an open and honest process about what became a very contentious issue.
Yeah, that was a very controversial situation there a couple of years ago when she was first hired. Howard, I wanted to turn to you to have you tell us a little bit about the story you wrote had on VPR about rural roads or the state sort of imposing some new regulations on maintenance of roads. It was quite fascinating. It was something I had been completely blissfully unaware of, but sounds pretty interesting. It sounds like a couple of road commissioners are going to be taking a certain amount of umbrage at this sort of enhanced direction.
Yeah, it's a very big deal, and a lot of people that were not intimately involved were surprised at just the reach of this. And this is Vermont's new clean water law, which drew out of the issue in Lake Champlain and the challenge of trying to clean up the lake. And when the lawmakers wrote this law 2 years ago, it actually extends to all the water in the state. And I spoke to a road foreman in West Windsor, and he said water runs downhill. And that's basically at the root of this law, is that all water ends up eventually in the Connecticut River or in Lake Champlain, in Long Island Sound. And so the state is trying to start this at the source. And it's a very comprehensive law. It has to do with agriculture, it has to do with runoff, it has to do with stormwater and wastewater. And also another aspect of this law is that there are now road permits for upkeep on the state's roads. And this is a very big deal. It's the first time that Montpelier has had and will have oversight over local roads. And a lot of road foremen and forewomen are upset about this. And there's all sorts of aspects, and money is one of the big ones. And so there were a few things that happened. This week is the state still doesn't have a comprehensive plan on how all this cleanup is going to happen. And clean water advocates have been asking the state to really figure it out. There were some ideas floated this week that maybe there's going to be a per parcel tax, so to speak, and that every landowner in the state is going to pay $1 or $2. And supposedly that would raise $4 or $5 million a year, which is not going to get us there, but it's a start. And so what's happening now is that these road permits start on January 1st, so starting next year. And it's not every road in the state and every town in the state. So what the state did is they did this really intricate mapping system. And they mapped every single road in the state. They looked at its pitch, and it's mostly roads that run near culverts and streams and creeks like that. And so there are now going to be standards so that all of this riprap and culverts that the towns that we talk about at town meeting are now going to have state standards. And if you redo a road and fill in a ditch, you're going to have to do it with stone that's of such weight, and you're going to have to dig it down to state standards. And this is going to cost the towns a lot of money. Now, the state has some money put aside for that, and they've got some federal money, but what the Vermont Leagues of Cities and Towns is worried about, that while these permits are going into action, there's not a long-term way of paying for this. And towns look a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road when they're doing their road plans. And so a lot of towns are really upset that the state is kind of setting these standards, calling it unfunded mandates, and we've heard that before. And why?
Just once or twice.
Yeah, and so why I wrote this story is that over the past year they were kind of fine-tuning this permit, and those just went into place now. There was a draft and a comment period which ended about a month or two, and they start on January 1st. So there's a lot of worry about that. Like you said, I think a lot of people, I think towns are aware of it, and road foremen and workers are aware of it, but it's kind of gone under the radar. And I think that at town meeting this next year and in the subsequent years, it's going to raise some eyebrows when you're looking at your road budgets, and they're going to go up by 20%, 30%, 40% because there are regulations about it. The state is saying that this is going to save money down the pike, and the idea is that if you rebuild a road and you do it right, not only will it prevent runoff and prevent runoff from going into our lakes and rivers, but it also makes it less likely that roads will wash out anyway. So it's a pretty interesting issue. And again, we'll have to see how this plays out.
So, or would localities, if they have a road targeted on, it gets on the state's bad list or whatever, will they be able to kind of say, well, but no, on the other hand, we're doing this or that, or we have a plan to fix that? Do they have any kind of
No,
recourse?
this is a permit system, and the state is going to have to permit all road upgrades now. It's really, really big change.
Wow.
I mean, right now, and I spoke to the road foreman in West Windsor. He'd been taking care of the roads there for 30 years. And so he was, he was upset that some people up in Montpelier were going to tell him how to take care of the roads. He took me on.
Sounds like Act 46.
Yeah, he took me on a drive, and the state put this map together, and they looked at the pitch of the road and everything else. But he took me on roads where he said it's just overkill. That this is not near a stream and it's not steep, and for us to take the time to do this and put the money into this, he was pretty upset about it.
Well, one other topic that's been sort of bubbling along there under the surface, no pun intended or anything like that, is the whole question of Bennington and Windham County sort of attempting to work together more cooperatively. In 2015, the state legislature passed the Southern Vermont Economic Zone Act, which kind of created a committee to look at some of the issues that were being faced by both counties in terms of their ability to grow and kind of keep up with the rest of the state. Things like demographics and lack of enough skilled workers were a couple of things I remember hearing come out of that group. So meanwhile, the Bennington County Regional Commission and the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation have been working together, and earlier this month announced that their proposal for a comprehensive economic development strategy, I think I got that right, or CEDS, had been approved by the federal government. So I suppose that enables them to tap into some financing to kind of do some more work along this area. But I guess I just wondered, as both of you have been covering your respective beats, have you been hearing much about this in terms of either excitement by local officials that, oh wow, this is going to make our jobs easier and really help us build the local economy and create jobs and do all the things that people want us to do? Or is it kind of just still sort of off to one side of things?
Well, the people have certainly been active doing this. As you said, the CEDS plan was approved. I'm not sure if you really sat down with a pencil and looked at what's really happened. I mean, the people are working hard on it, and it's also a very long-term strategy. In Windham County, the whole conversation kind of grew out of the Vermont Yankee closing and us losing 600 jobs in the area. So we needed to kind of plan for the future. This is a statewide issue with job training and trying to get people starting in high school. So I think the work is happening, and I think it's a long-term strategy, and it is moving forward. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think the people's hearts are in the right place. And
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in Bennington County we have maybe a little bit more work because we have to play catch up with Windham County a little bit. A lot of initiatives that have been underway there for a few years are kind of just getting rolling here now, but people are definitely excited about it. Zerwat Chiduri, Bennington's new economic development director, just submitted a pretty glowing report about what they've been doing to the select board in Bennington. Other select boards of smaller towns who maybe aren't directly involved in this most recent project, but are definitely part of the economic development as a whole, they're having new conversations. Tim Scoggins, chairman of the Shaftesbury Select Board, has been very involved in these conversations. And that leads to discussions on the local level. Well, maybe how do we play our part in this? Maybe we make it easier for retail businesses to move into our downtown. As we know, Shaftesbury doesn't really have a downtown per se, but maybe there's that potential there. And those discussions have started where maybe they didn't exist before. So that's one positive that's come out of this. At least in this area, we're still kind of in the planning stages for how some of these funds are going to be used, how we're going to directly invest in these projects. But the discussions are happening, and where they really weren't 2 or 3 years ago, at least on this side of things.
Yeah, that is a big step forward, because I remember about in 2015 or so when this conversation first began to start happening, just the fact of getting towns together, towns within the same county, to kind of like talk to each other about how they could work together seemed like kind of a big deal. And of course, we see the same thing still kind of underway in a way up here in the northern end of the county, with Manchester and the Bennington Area Chamber of Commerce trying to work together, against the background of fewer retail outlet shops than there used to be, and causing some local angst about that.
Sure, and no matter how you define regional, whether it's Bennington and Manchester or Bennington and Brattleboro, definitely seeing any type of cooperation is certainly a big step forward, but I think people have to remember this is definitely a long-term process. This is not going to be something that's done within 2 or 3 years. But really, the discussions from everyone I've talked to have been fruitful so far, even if there isn't a lot directly to show for it yet.
Right. Going back to Vermont Yankee just real quick before we have to bring this to a close, the sale of that is supposed to be financing some of these initiatives, right?
And it has been. A lot of energy projects is financed from the closing of Vermont Yankee. And the proposed sale to North Star Services, which is the company that wants to buy Vermont Yankee from Entergy, decommission it, clean it up, is kind of moving ahead. And the state and federal regulatory hearings are going to be happening next year. And so we're going to know a lot more about how that looks. The people in Vernon/Windham County, the business community really likes this plan, because this company says they're going to clean up Yankee decades ahead of Entergy, and they're going to be able to develop that site decades ahead. But there are some questions about the company that wants to buy it. The NRC, a month ago or so, asked them for some more financial information. They have this great plan that on paper and with some spreadsheets looks like it's going to work, but there are a lot of questions about where are the finances behind it and whether they'll really be able to pull this off. So that's all going to be rolling out next year. Again, hearings in Washington with the NRC and the state, they both have to approve it. So we're going to see how that plays out too.
It'll be a chance to write many more stories about Vermont Yankee. Just when you thought that was done.
Never.
No.
Never.
Well, anyway, gentlemen, thank you for taking the time out of your day to be with us today and share your insights into all these stories. I want to thank Derek Carson of the Bennington Banner and Howard Weiss-Tisman of Vermont Public Radio for being with us today, and we're glad that you came along for the ride as well. This has been the Press Pass on GNet TV, and I want to wish you the best for Thanksgiving and the holiday season, and we'll see you again the next time. Have a good day.